this nerdy stuff this week. So this is what I enjoy, and I hope that it'll be helpful for you. But we're going to be talking about the biological impact of birth control. In summary, we're going to be talking about synthetic hormones in birth control. We're also going to be talking about how birth control interrupts our natural hormone processes and the signs that our body might be protecting us from that birth control, as well as preserving future fertility. If you like this video and want to watch more, subscribe and hit the bell so you'll get notified when I make more videos just like this one. To start, what is hormonal birth control? Hormonal birth control are chemicals that look a lot like our hormones. They bind to the same receptors in our cells that hormones bind to, but they're different. So they have this other part. So for example, if it were my 3 fingers here, this top part might fit into our cell receptor, and then the back part might look different. So it might have 2 parts. And because we're synthesizing this, when we're in a lab and we're making this medicine, it's something that we can't exactly make that hormone sometimes, or we don't want to make just that hormone. So we're going to make something that is a little bit like it in order to patent it, own that chemical ourselves, and be able to license people to use it. And that can have good and bad aspects. So the good aspects are, for example, when we have something like progesterone, if someone has low progesterone or low estrogen levels and they're not ovulating, we can encourage ovulation. This is part of what is done in IVF. However, that other part, that secondary part, is going to also have an effect. So it might plug into the estrogen or progesterone receptors, but it also might plug into other receptors. It might have side effects, and that's what side effects are. That means that that side of the chemical that we're putting into our body, the synthetic hormone, is going to have another effect. It's going to react with something in our body, in our bloodstream, in our cells, in our tissues. It's going to be metabolized. It might look a little different, and then it might do something. And so those are all things that we might want to consider when we're considering taking hormonal birth control. We don't have fake hormones in our natural environment. That's just not normal. We have other hormones. We have plant hormones. We have animal hormones that we're exposed to as well. But those are natural forms of hormones. And they can't be patented. So that's part of why drug companies don't produce those. They can't patent them because they're in nature. And so this is just something to consider when we are putting something like hormonal birth control into our body. They contain these synthetic hormones that have been produced by a company, and they also have been designed in order to be detoxified. So they often are lipids, because all of our hormones are fat-based, so they're going to be detoxified in a little bit of a different way, primarily through our liver, because that's what processes fats and fat-soluble substances. So that's something to consider if someone has chronic constipation, if they have liver issues, could that contribute to it? So these are all things from a biological standpoint someone might want to consider for their own body, and then also considering the environmental impact. If we are detoxifying from these chemicals, we are going to have to pass them out of our body. They might be in a slightly changed way, but they might not be completely changed. We might pass things like whole pills in our bowel movements, and so some of those are going to get into our water system. We do know that birth control is flushed down toilets, not just by us going to the bathroom, but also people just dumping pills, and that can be contributing to some women actually having higher levels of certain hormones if they are having public water. So this isn't meant to freak you out. It's just to give you a biological perspective on how this could affect animals, how this can be affecting plants, how this can be affecting more than just you and your body when you're making this choice to take hormonal birth control. So these are all things that we might want to consider, because it's not going to just affect us, and that will be the most strongly affected individual, but it does have a ripple effect as well. Okay, so now we've looked at the big picture of environmental impact. Let's start notching down, and we're going to talk about our body. And we're first going to talk about our hormones in our body. Naturally, we have what are called hormone feedback loops. These are positive or negative feedback loops. And that means that if they're positive, something is encouraged to happen more and more. If it's negative, it's turned off or discouraged. So for example, when we have sugar, we eat sugar, it's in our bloodstream, we produce insulin in order to help that sugar be metabolized and put into our cell so we can use it. Otherwise, sugar in the form of glucose can be very dangerous for our body. It can damage our organs, actually. So that's what causes neuropathy and tissue damage for diabetics who don't have enough insulin to get that sugar out of their bloodstream and into their cell. So that's something to consider. We have these natural feedback loops that help keep our body in process and in alignment. So for women, we have hormone feedback loops that help us regulate ovulation, help us regulate our menstrual cycle. It also helps regulate our mood to some degree, and it can contribute to things like menopause, perimenopause, and us even not going through puberty sometimes. So all of these hormones are contributing. We kind of have like a soup of hormones in our body that's going on, and their messages being passed back and forth. That's what hormones are. They're a little package, kind of like a letter that's being sent most likely from our brain down to another organ in our body to send a signal, and then other hormones will go back to the brain to send another signal back. So this is where I talked about that loop. So usually there's things that are looping back and forth, especially for women. We have our pituitary gland, our hypothalamus, we have our ovaries, and we have our adrenal glands and our thyroid. Those are going to contribute to female hormones. So when a woman takes hormonal birth control, what it's going to do is interrupt that loop. So it's either going to put a stop to production in our brain, or it's going to put a stop to production in our organs of a certain hormone. And it can do that by elevating our blood levels of certain synthetic hormones. So often for many birth controls, that is in the form of estrogen and progesterone. They elevate those levels of hormones in a way that kind of mimics pregnancy. And because of that, that can come with certain side effects. So not only are we taking a synthetic hormone that can have its own side effects just by reacting differently on that other side, but we can also have effects just from having natural levels of increase in our natural hormones, even though it's not our natural hormones. Our body believing that can stop ovulation. It can stop things like our menstrual cycle. And it can stop our body's brain from communicating with our ovaries. And one of the biggest things that can happen is we won't have the production of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, or luteinizing hormone, because our estrogen and progesterone levels will remain the same. Those hormones won't spike to signal ovulation, so we won't be having an egg, and that's part of what can prevent pregnancy. It can also mean that because we aren't developing uterine lining and shedding that every month, it will have different effects in our blood and our iron levels. And in general, some of this, what do you think of when a woman gets pregnant for the first 4 to 12 weeks? She's starting to put on some weight. She is preparing to be able to hold a baby in her body for the next 40 weeks. And so that can come with some things like some mood imbalances. Like I said, weight gain. There can be general inflammation from having these synthetic hormones in our body as well. So it's not abnormal to have those types of symptoms. And it can start to affect, like I said, our adrenal glands, our thyroid, and our pituitary gland are all interconnected with our reproductive system. So those are going to have effects if we're pretending to be pregnant for a prolonged amount of time. So I hope this is making sense. I'd love for you to share in the comments if you're finding this interesting, if it's been helpful, and I'd love to talk with you there. So the next thing that I kind of wanted to talk about are some of the protective mechanisms that our body has. So we do have protection from certain substances kind of flooding our bloodstream, and our body can keep up with them sometimes, not always. Obviously, we've heard of overdoses from medications, and so that's not always the case. But when we have something like a hormone, if we have high levels of certain hormones, it not only will signal weight gain, but having high levels of them will possibly need to be removed from our bloodstream. And one of the ways that we store estrogen is in our fat cells. Our fat cells also produce estrogen. So not only are you storing it, but you're encouraging its production further. So birth control is something that's dosed out. It's kind of a standard. So it's not that some women have a lower dose and one woman might have a higher dose, and vice versa. There are low dose birth controls, but everyone on low dose birth control will have the same dose. It's not personalized. So that's what I'm referring to. And keeping that in mind, some women who are more sensitive to these hormones, they might have even some reactions to having that low dose of the hormone being in their bloodstream because our body might not be able to metabolize it as quickly. Therefore, it stays around longer. There's higher levels in our bloodstream, no matter whether it's low dose, high dose, medium dose, all of those things. That can mean that our body has to find another resource in order to protect our essential organs. So we have these, like I said, protective mechanisms. One is fat storage. So we can store things away in our fat, and that can help protect and buffer our essential organs from these excess hormones. We can also have things like nausea. It will make us nauseous when we have high hormone levels. That's another symptom that women might see in pregnancy. That's why some women on birth control might get really nauseous. If we have high levels of hormones that our liver or kidneys can't excrete as fast as it's necessary, they build up, and our body has a mechanism that says, please stop putting this in here. And so that is something to keep in mind. If someone goes on birth control, might have nausea. Headaches is another one. And so what can happen is some of these hormones can cause interruptions in our neurotransmitters. So it can cause depletion of certain nutrients, including things like magnesium, which is essential for our nerves to communicate back and forth, for our muscles to be relaxed. So this can contribute to things, like I said, like headaches. If you don't have enough magnesium, you don't have other essential nutrients that are going to be depleted by using birth control just naturally, because we're going to need to detoxify that. Some of those nutrients are used in metabolizing hormones, and so they're naturally going to be depleted faster if you have more hormones to detoxify. So headaches is another sign, and our body is a really good tool at telling us what it needs and helping to clue us in that something's not quite going right. So headaches is another situation that can happen when a woman has too many hormones in her body. And again, that's something that women can experience in early pregnancy as well sometimes. And the next thing that we're going to talk about is our future fertility. So when we are taking a synthetic hormone like birth control in order to prevent pregnancy, we do need to consider that we're stopping a whole loop that's naturally meant to just keep going for the rest of our lives until we're pregnant. And then it kind of goes on halt, but then it comes back because there are other hormone signals through pregnancy, through giving birth, that naturally help that rhythm restart again. So these are things that we just want to keep in mind. And when we put a stop to that cycle, that loop, it can be difficult for it to start back up again. That's part of why we might be seeing higher rates of infertility. And women who need to regain that cycle being reconnected between our brain and our ovaries, or our thyroid and our ovaries, and our pituitary gland and our thyroid and our adrenals, and all of those organs working together in sync, we need to keep that at the forefront of our mind, that it might take some time for our body to readjust. When our pituitary gland hasn't produced FSH, or luteinizing hormone, for a long time, it can kind of atrophy. Our organs can atrophy when they aren't being used for certain things. So maybe it won't be able to produce as much of the hormones that it needs. So it might take some time for it to get back to that. And we do need to consider how long we've been on those, and how long our body's been able to not have to produce that, and how much atrophy could have happened, or just kind of a lower affinity on some of our cells in our uterus and our ovaries for our natural hormones, if they also have that hormonal birth control still in place. Sometimes we need to detoxify from that, encourage it to be removed from our body in order for us to regain certain types of connections hormonally between our body. So that's something that we might want to keep in mind. As a biological impact, is our future fertility might be a little bit delayed if we are expecting it to not be pregnant for a long period of time, go off of these hormones, and are expecting to immediately have a child. That loop that's triggering ovulation might not be there yet. So, and last but not least, we as a biologist, we want to consider what happens generationally among a species or an animal. And so when a woman is exposed to these high levels of hormones, whether or not she has them in her body when she is getting pregnant, we might have some residuals stored in our tissues. As I mentioned, that's part of our protective mechanism. And some of these could be high estrogen levels, they could be high progesterone levels, different types of synthetic hormones as well. And when we do get pregnant, those being released, even in small amounts, there could be effects on our children. What does that look like on an embryo developing when there are high estrogen levels around? We don't know that they can cross the placental barrier, so maybe it might not necessarily be a damage to the baby, but it could influence a child's gender development, their development of certain organs, our reproductive organs primarily, as well as neurological development. And so if there's a high level of some of these hormones, especially estrogen, it's going to change maybe how that child develops. And so, like I said, this isn't necessarily to concern anybody, but it's just something to keep in mind when we are making the choice to use hormonal birth control. These are things down the line that might be a later effect, whether they're on our children or on our children's children as well. And so just to keep in mind that our choices have a ripple effect. So, and last but not least, we want to talk about how these hormones could affect our embryo development when we do want to get pregnant. So because we've had these high levels of estrogen and progesterone in our body, how could that maybe affect our growing baby? Could it affect their gender? Because if there's high levels of estrogen when they're developing, could that influence their reproductive organs being formed? We don't know. But the other thing that we want to consider is, did it nutrient deplete us? And should we be replenishing some of those nutrients through our diet, through supplementation prior to having a baby and preparing to get pregnant? Because some of those things, like I had talked about, magnesium can get depleted, B vitamins can get depleted, and some of those are essential in us developing a healthy baby from the get-go. Within the first 7 days of an embryo being fertilized, that is when we have neural tube development. We start having certain things develop that are very essential for our baby, and making sure that before we try to get pregnant, we replenish those through our diet, like I talked about, as well as through supplementation through prenatal vitamins. Prenatal vitamins being started even before you start trying to have a baby is a great way to make sure that your body has enough of that folate, those vitamin E, all of those nutrients, magnesium, selenium, that could have been depleted when we were taking hormonal birth control. So again, from a biological perspective, it's not just our generation, our body, our individual, it's the next generation. So how does that affect the next generation down the line? So keeping that in mind is something that I think women should do when they are making a choice of what they do with their own body, because it doesn't just affect them, it'll affect the next generation. And I have worked in the health field for the last 10 years, and while I have seen wonderful recoveries from chronic illness, from cancer even, it has been truly heartbreaking to hear when really young babies are very sick. And so that's something that I want to implore women to consider, is when they are preparing to have a baby, whether it be now or 10 years from now, to keep in mind how we treat our bodies so that we can encourage a healthy baby and it be something that is life-giving and enjoyable, rather than something that could be heartbreaking. So I hope that this was helpful. And if you want to watch any of the Feminine Rhythm videos about how you can nutritionally support yourself through any phase of your menstrual cycle, I'll have the links below. And if you have any questions, feel free to share them in the comments. And until next time, be well.